Hello everyone. Welcome back to Classical Archaeology. This is Unit 5, Bronze and Early Iron Age Greece. In this video, we'll discuss some of the major Bronze Age Greek civilizations. We'll discuss the origins of the people that would become the Greek Bronze Age civilizations. Then we'll discuss some of the important characteristics of the Greek Bronze Age civilizations, like the Cycladic civilization, the Minoan civilization, and the Mycenaean civilization. We'll discuss their artifacts and some of their important cultural attributes. Then we'll close this video by discussing the Bronze Age collapse and how it affected these civilizations, specifically the Mycenaean civilization. We'll discuss what cultures emerged from the Bronze Age collapse during the so-called Greek Dark Age, and how the events of this period lead to the development of archaic Greece, which is a topic that we'll discuss in a future video. By the way, the image of this slide is a fresco from Crete depicting the Lily Prince, a member of the elite class in the society of ancient Crete. Here we'll discuss the people who would come to be known as the Greeks. The Greeks were among the first Europeans to adopt agriculture during their Neolithic period, roughly 4000 BCE, due to their close proximity to Anatolia and Mesopotamia. Agriculture develops in Anatolia and Mesopotamia, and Greece was right across the Aegean Sea from these regions, making the transfer of agriculture much easier. A series of cultural groups in the land that would become Greece created socioeconomic bases for the Bronze Age civilizations that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. Those are the Cycladic, Minoan, and Mycenaean civilizations. These cultural groups, called the Eutraces, the Karaku, from 3200 to 2650 BCE, and 2650 to 2200 BCE, respectively, are also known as the Hellenic cultures. The Eutraces culture is known for their pottery advancements and adoption of bronze. The Karaku are known for their building of large, semi-monumental architecture, like the House of Tiles, which we'll look at later. Other cultures existed, but they'd be much less influential than the Cycladic culture, the Minoan culture, or the Mycenaean culture. Early Greek civilizations are known for their ceramics and their pottery, especially the Eutraces. These early societies, like the Eutraces and the Karaku, probably did not have their own writing systems, but later societies did, especially the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, who both developed their own scripts. The Minoans used a script called Linear A, the Mycenaeans used a script called Linear B. Some archaeologists think that early settlements, founded by people like the Eutraces and the Karaku, would become the basis of larger settlements for the Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, although there's some debate on this point. Here's an illustration of the stratigraphy of Greece during the Hellenic periods. You have Hellenic I, which is lower than Hellenic II. An important trend across Greek history and an important part of Greek culture is seafaring. The Greek peninsula is very rugged, dominated by mountains, like Mount Olympus, seen here. Mount Olympus was traditionally the home of the Greek pantheon. These mountains made agriculture difficult for the ancient Greeks. The mountains also made traversing Greece in the nearby regions by land very difficult, As such, for the ancient Greeks, it was much easier to travel long distances by sea, leading the Greeks, especially the Minoans, to become a seafaring civilization. We'll talk more about Greek seafaring in later videos. Here are some examples of early Greek pottery, specifically from the Eutrasis culture. You can see that the potters are beginning to experiment with ornamentation, although the ornamentation is much simpler than what we'll see in later periods of Greek ceramics. Pottery is an essential tool and technology for agricultural societies, as pottery is used to store harvested grains like wheat. Pottery keeps out the air, preventing oxidation. It keeps out water, preventing decomposition. It also can keep out pests like mice and rats if the pottery is sealed with a lid of some kind. Pottery can also be used to store other liquid agricultural products like olive oil and wine. We'll talk more about olive oil and wine and their importance to Greek foodways and culture in a later video. Here's an image of the foundation of the House of Tiles built by the Karakou people. It was built in the Peloponnesian region, which is the southern peninsula of Greece. Here you can see that it's a combination of materials, including bricks and stone. Unlike the ancient Near Eastern civilizations, which built much of their architecture out of mud bricks, the Greeks had access to a variety of materials, including bricks, but also wood and stone, allowing their architecture to be more diverse in terms of materials. Stone also preserves much better and leaves behind more evidence for archaeologists to investigate. Here's a partial reconstruction of the House of Tiles. It has its name because of its tile roof, showing that the Greeks were experimenting with ceramics, making not only pottery, but building materials as well. Tiles like these will be used in later periods as well. Here's an archaeological plan of the House of Tiles site. As you can see, the site was inhabited through many different periods, including the Neolithic and then the Hellenic periods. The site also contains graves as well, shown here. We'll talk more about burial rituals amongst the Bronze Age Greeks later on in this video. Now we'll discuss the Cycladic civilization. Cycladic civilization was a seafaring civilization that inhabited the islands of the Aegean Sea from about 3200 to 2000 BCE. Although some archaeologists think they may have inhabited these islands as late as 1000 BCE. The Cycladic civilization also had a presence on the Greek mainland as well. Archaeologists and scholars think the Cycladic civilization focused on seafaring, fishing, and trading. Perhaps their greatest cultural accomplishment are their figurines, seen here. Here are the Cycladic Islands, right in the middle of the Aegean Sea. In archaeology, just like real estate, we believe in the rule of location. Location, location, location. The Cycladic Islands, centered right in the middle of the Aegean Sea, would have given the people of the Cycladic civilization easy access to the Greek mainland, to Crete, and also to Asia Minor, facilitating their trade expeditions. Here are some examples of Cycladic figurines. Most of their figurines are fairly small, no more than a few feet high. Initial sculptures are very geometric, but they become rounder with time as the sculptor's techniques improved. Over time, anatomical features in clothing would become clearer. So seriation, as a form of relative dating, works well with the Cycladic figurines. Over time, the Cycladic sculptures made their images more anatomically correct. They also added clothing. We think these triangles represent loincloths, and we think this pattern here represents some kind of bandolier. The cycladic civilization also made pottery. We call these examples of cycladic pottery frying pans. You can see there's quite a bit of sophistication even from this early Greek civilization. These carvings are very intricate, and scholars think they may have some kind of symbolic meaning. Perhaps they represent the sun or waves of the sea, things that would have been very important to the Cycladic people. The decorations are very ornate. These vessels don't show any sign of being used for cooking. There's no signs of burning or carbon. We think they may have been ritual objects. Perhaps they held mirrors at some point. Here is an artistic recreation of what Cycladic people would have looked like. As you can see, they're using primitive bronze weapons. They've also decorated themselves with paint, drawing designs that are very similar to those found on the fry pans. We can also see some of their figurines here in the background. The artist who drew this image probably drew from images of the later Minoan civilization in order to create these people. Here are some views of Cycladic settlements in the Aegean Islands. As you can see, they're building out of stone, and they're building separate buildings within their complexes, suggesting different spaces for work, sleep, leisure, and storage, or for separation of family units. We also see that their settlements have walls, implying they were possibly trying to keep foreign invaders, perhaps the Minoans, out. They may also have been trying to guard treasures they had gained during their trading expeditions, perhaps from pirates. Now we'll discuss the end of the Cycladic civilization. The Cycladic civilization seems to have begun to dissolve around 2000 BCE, losing much of its cultural influence. The Cycladic civilization was probably absorbed into the larger and more powerful Minoan culture. Some archaeologists think that a natural disaster, like a volcano, might have hastened the Cycladic decline, as seen with many other ancient civilizations. Some archaeologists think that pockets of Cycladic culture may have existed as late as 1000 BCE. Now we'll shift gears and talk about the more well-known Minoan civilization. The Minoan civilization lasted from about 2200 to about 1450 BCE, although some scholars will debate these dates. The civilization has been named after their legendary king Minos, who we'll talk about later. Minos may actually have been their word for king or ruler. The Minoan civilization was centered on the island of Crete, but it was influential throughout the Aegean Islands and even on the Greek mainland. The Minoan civilization was documented by archaeologist Sir Arthur Evans from about 1900 to 1905 of the Common Era. You can see Evans at left. The Minoans, based on their archaeological evidence, seem to have been a very wealthy civilization based around seafaring and trade. To facilitate their trade, the Minoans developed a writing system called Linear A, which as of yet has been untranslated. The Minoans are known for their palaces, like Knossos, seen here at the right, and for their colorful frescoes. The Minoan civilization collapsed from a variety of factors. We think natural disasters played a role, but foreign invasions, possibly from the Mycenaeans, probably also destroyed their civilization as well. Here is a map of the Minoan trade networks, showing what products they bought and sold and where. As you can see, the Minoans may have traded with places as far flung as Spain on the far western coast of the Mediterranean. They were also trading heavily with Egypt and with the ancient Near East, and of course with the Greek mainland. They may have even traded with the Italian peninsula as well. Here's a fresco showing Minoan seafaring. The fresco features a sailing vessel in the foreground and a harbor in the background, highlighting the importance of seafaring trade to the Minoans. Here are some images of Linear A. Archaeologists and philologists, people who study languages, are not sure if Linear A is an alphabet or if it's a writing system that combines pictograms with symbols that represent syllables. As of now, Linear A remains undeciphered. But it does bear some similarities with Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaeans. Linear B, by the way, has been translated. The Minoan civilization is known for its art, especially frescoes. Minoan two-dimensional art was dominated by frescoes. Frescoes are a type of painting that involves the decoration of wet plaster. They take their name from the Italian word fresco for fresh. Artists would paint their figures into the wet plaster. These pigments would dry with the plaster over time, and although some restoration has had to be done on the Minoan frescoes, they're remarkably well preserved because of this painting method. We can see that in the frescoes, the Minoan artists preferred to display their subjects from the profile perspective, much like the Egyptians, suggesting a possible Egyptian influence. The human figures are stylized and triangular, like the Egyptians, although it's my personal opinion that the Minoans depicted their human subjects in a manner that's a little bit more anatomically correct. But what you see is the Minoans depicted their subjects, their human subjects, with very narrow waists, like the Egyptian art. So there's a cross-pollination of artistic traditions. Male subjects, men, are usually portrayed with darker skin than women. Men are portrayed here on the left. These two images are of frescoes of women on the right. The frescoes usually do not include inscriptions or captions. Even if they did, we probably wouldn't be able to read them because they'd be written in Linear A. These frescoes give archaeologists important glimpses into everyday Minoan life, including their class and gender norms. As you can see, men are portrayed with darker skin, women are portrayed with lighter skin. This may show the Minoan civilization's preference for men working outdoors, developing tanner skin, while women work indoors with the family, showing that the Minoan civilization was more patriarchal than matriarchal. We also see class differences as well, particularly in how working class and upper class Minoans are attired, what kind of clothing they wear. We'll discuss that on another slide. Here are some images of working class Minoans portrayed in fresco. Working class Minoans tended to wear simpler clothing than the elite Minoans did, but there were some similarities in how they dressed. Working class Minoans are usually shown completing some kind of work, like fishing or picking saffron flowers, an important agricultural task. Both men and women of the working class seem to have worn some type of bluish-gray head covering that was probably woven, almost like a modern-day beanie. Perhaps this head covering had holes out of which the Minoans would put braids of their hair, or these could be some kind of decorative fabric added to these head coverings. We're just not sure. Once again, men are portrayed with a darker complexion, highlighting outdoor work. We also see continuities in how working class and upper class women dressed. Working class women's clothing tended to be a bit simpler, but like that of the upper class women, it tended to be very revealing. The bust area and cleavage was exposed, and the clothing overall tended to be very sexualized. Men wore small loincloths. Women wore clothing that was very revealing also. It also appears that women of all classes wore earrings of some kind. There's also evidence to suggest that Minoan women wore cosmetics. Here is an image of an upper-class Minoan woman being attended by men of the working class. As you can see, her dress is very revealing, and all the subjects are portrayed with very small waists. Here is a fresco of a working-class Minoan harvesting saffron flowers, while an upper-class woman looks on. Because of their significant wealth, the Minoans had increased resource surpluses and thus increased divisions of labor. These surpluses and divisions would have allowed more time for leisure, entertainment, and sports. One activity depicted in the frescoes was bull leaping, seen here. Bull leaping may have been a sport, but it may have also had spiritual and religious connotations, which we'll discuss later. What's interesting is this fresco shows both women and men participating in bull leaping. The male figure, portrayed in red, leaps over the bull and is flanked by two women. Perhaps they're distracting the bull while the man leaps over, or perhaps they're getting ready to leap over the bull themselves. We don't exactly know what the original artists intended with this fresco. Perhaps this is meant to be an action shot of some kind, or perhaps it's meant to be a progression, with one woman having leaped first, followed by the man, as another woman gets ready to leap. In a way, perhaps, it's an ancient comic strip. Here is a restoration, an enhancement of the bull leaping fresco. You can see that the male has the beginnings of a slight beard, which is somewhat unusual because Minoan males are usually portrayed clean-shaven. The women wear similar garb to the male bull leaper, which once again suggests that they're not just in this image for show, they're here because women participated in bull leaping as well. The Minoans also enjoyed boxing. Boxing was a blood sport that could be bet on. Images of Minoan boxing often depict young boys fighting. It's possible that boxing may have been a form of military training as well for the Minoans. In addition to portraying people and activities, the Minoans also portrayed animals in their frescoes. This fresco shows dolphins and a variety of species of fish. And this piece of a fresco here shows pheasants, which would have been an important food source for the Minoans. Here's a partial reconstruction of the Palace of Knossos with a fresco and colored columns. The Palace of Knossos, based on archaeological research, was a very large, impressive complex that was ornately decorated with frescoes and colored columns. As you can see, it has a variety of chambers for different types of use. It features courts, halls, areas for performances, places where arms are stored, storage areas, and even places of burial. Visitors to the Palace of Knossos would have been impressed with its size. They may have even been intimidated by its large collection of labyrinth-like rooms, but we'll discuss labyrinths more in a moment. Here are some artists' recreations of life at the Palace of Knossos. Here's a representation of the Lily Prince seen at the beginning of this video. As you can see, life for the elite of the Minoan civilization was probably pretty good, but it was dependent upon the labor of the working and lower classes, and probably on slaves as well, seen here and here. Their labor would have kept the upper classes fed, allowing them to pursue things like entertainment. Now we'll briefly discuss the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur, because I think it reveals how contemporary civilizations might have viewed the Minoans. Keep in mind, though, that the legend of Theseus and the Minotaur was recorded centuries after the Minoan civilization came to an end. For those of you that are not aware of the story, Theseus, Prince of Athens, kills the Minotaur, a bull man monster belonging to King Minos of Crete. Theseus accomplishes this with the help of Minos' daughter Ariadne, shown here. The Minotaur lived in a labyrinth and consumed human prisoners. The large size of the Palace of Knossos and bull leaping and the stratified nature of Minoan society, with the elite being dependent on the labor of the working class, may have also inspired this myth. The Minoan religion, which included elements of human sacrifice and worship of animal deities, may have also played into this story as well. Perhaps the Minotaur was not a monster, but a priest wearing a bull mask of some kind. This myth also reveals the tension between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans of the Greek mainland. Theseus was from Athens, on the Greek mainland. Most of the images we have of Theseus and Ariadne are from centuries later. Here you can see a Greek image from centuries after the Minoans, and you can see later medieval and Renaissance era depictions of the myth. Here are some artifacts to illustrate Minoan religion and spirituality. Based on the artifacts we have, archaeologists think that the Minoan religion was more pantheistic than the religion of the Greeks in later periods. There's a possible Egyptian and Mesopotamian influence in the Minoan religion as a result of the trade relations between the Minoans, the Egyptians, and the people of the ancient Near East. Bulls seem to be sacred to the Minoans based on their depiction of bulls in their carvings, seen at right. Archaeologists also think that the Minoans may have worshipped a mother goddess with snakes, seen here at left. Interestingly, the Minoans also allowed women to serve as priestesses, something that not all ancient civilizations permitted. The Minoan burial rituals and tombs were fairly simple compared to those of the other civilizations we've discussed, especially the Egyptians. They built small stone tombs, seen here, and they interred their dead in decorated sarcophagi, like this example here. Their tombs are much less ornate than their palace, like at Knossos. How did the Minoan civilization come to an end? Evidence suggests that the Minoan civilization collapsed as an independent entity between the years 1450 and 1200 BCE. The Santorini volcano, further to the north in the Aegean Islands, erupted around 1600 BCE, and it may have caused flooding and earthquakes as far away as Crete, seen here on the right. Some scholars think that this natural disaster may have inspired the later legend of Atlantis. Volcanic ash from the Santorini volcano may have caused crop failures and famines as well. These cataclysmic events would have made it more difficult to fend off foreign invasions, especially from the Mycenaeans, who would have had a score to settle with the Minoans, as shown by the story of Theseus and the Minotaur. There is evidence of a Mycenaean takeover by the 1200s BCE, in which the palace of Knossos was damaged. Now we'll discuss Mycenaean Greece, a civilization which lasted from about 1750 to 1050 BCE. Like the later Greek city-states, the Mycenaean Greeks were not united into a single empire. Rather, there were spheres of influence within Mycenaean Greece, one surrounding Mycenae, their most important city, but also one around what would become Sparta and what would become Athens. Athens and Sparta were probably small settlements or villages at this point. Mycenae, by far, was their most important city. Here is a view of Mycenae's Lion Gate and the dry stone wall fortifications of this city. The Mycenaean civilization was centered on mainland Greece, and it was divided into smaller kingdoms, which we saw a moment ago. Mycenae was by far the most powerful. These principalities would evolve into the Greek city-states of the Archaic and Classical period. The Mycenaeans, architecturally speaking, are known for their tombs and their fortresses called citadels. Here's an image of the citadel of Knossos, and here's an image of their Tholos tomb, also called a beehive tomb because of its round shape. The Mycenaeans produced some artwork, including frescoes, but they're best known for their burial masks, which were very unique and ornate. The Mycenaeans' frescoes are not nearly as good as those of the Minoans. The Mycenaeans were also far more warlike than the Minoans were. The Mycenaeans used bronze weapons to attack rival fortresses and citadels, like Troy, as described in the Homeric epics. The Mycenaean civilization collapsed around the 1000s BCE after an invasion from the iron-using people called the Dorians. The most important archaeologist to investigate the Mycenaean civilization was Heinrich Schliemann, shown here on the right, who investigated the civilization in the 1870s. Schliemann was a very controversial figure within the history of archaeology, and you'll see why later. Here is a view of Linear B, the Mycenaean script. Symbolically, it looks a lot like Linear A, but scholars have actually been able to translate Linear B, something they failed to do for Linear A. Here is a view of the Mycenae archaeological site. As you can see, the Mycenaean Greeks used a lot more stone than the civilizations of the ancient Near East. They used a variety of different types of stone masonry as well. They used large stones arranged using dry stone masonry to create their walls, and they used smaller stonework to create interior buildings. Here's a view of the exterior walls of Mycenae, as well as a view of its famous Lion Gate. Because of how militaristic their civilization was, the Mycenaeans would have needed to guard their citadels, and walls would have been the best way of accomplishing this. On the whole, Mycenaean architecture is plainer than that of the Minoan culture, reflecting the more militaristic and war-like nature of the Mycenaean society. They built dry stone walls, they used different types of masonry, but they did make some elaborate gates, like the Lion Gate. Lions represented military strength and royalty in the ancient Mediterranean and ancient Near East. The Mycenaeans made frescoes as well, but they're not of the same quality as those made by the Minoans, as you'll see soon. Here are some images of Mycenaean frescoes. As you can see, they're not as detailed or intricate as the Minoan frescoes. Women, when they're portrayed in Mycenaean frescoes, are portrayed with a lot more clothing and in a less sexual manner. They're also portrayed as not being as slender in Mycenaean frescoes, possibly to reflect the more warlike nature of the Mycenaean society. The Mycenaeans may have been emphasizing fertility over sexuality, or they may have been trying to show their women as being more muscular. Overall, though, the skill of the Mycenaean fresco artists seems to be lower, even though these frescoes are generally newer than the ones made by the Minoans. So seriation would not work as a form of relative dating when dating frescoes of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. Here is an example of a chariot scene displayed in a Mycenaean fresco. You'll see that the Mycenaean fresco artists depicted their males with darker skin, just like the Minoans did. Here you can see the chariot made of bronze, and you can see the helmets they're wearing as well. These helmets were usually made of pieces of boar tusk. Here are some images of Mycenaean arms and weapons. The images at the top were found in a Mycenaean tomb, and then the figure on the right is wearing a modern-day reproduction of bronze Mycenaean armor. The Mycenaeans primarily used bronze weapons, especially melee weapons like swords and spears. Kings and officers, the members of the elite classes, would have worn heavy bronze armor and a boar tusk helmet, as seen on the model on the left-hand side of the slide. They also would have worn crests on the top of their helmets. These crests would have made the wearers look taller and more intimidating, but they may have been a way to indicate rank as well. Enlisted warriors from the working classes probably did not wear armor like this. They probably only wore a much simpler boar tusk helmet, and they might have had a shield made from leather and wood. Mycenaean warfare, because of its reliance on expensive bronze weapons, could have only worked in a stratified society, with a wealthy and well-armed and well-armored protected elite class, and then large numbers of lower-class recruits to serve as cannon fodder, or in ancient times, catapult fodder. Here's a vase from Athens showing Mycenaean warriors. You can see the boar tusk helmets, their spears, and then their shields and basic armor. These may be warriors from the upper class, based on their attire. Here are some modern artistic recreations of Mycenaean warriors. As you can see, the warriors of the elite class, with their crested helmets and their bronze armor, are much better protected than their working class subalterns, who just have helmets and shields. The Mycenaeans also used chariots as well, like the Egyptians and the ancient Near Eastern civilizations. With this background about Mycenaean warfare and weapons in mind, we can discuss the Trojan War. The Trojan War, as a historical event, took place sometime between 1260 and 1180 BCE. Most of our knowledge of the Trojan War is mixed with a significant amount of legend and myth created by the epic poem Homer, who developed his story of the Trojan War called the Iliad between the 900s and the 600s BCE, somewhere in that period. By the 1800s of the Common Era, Historians and early archaeologists had begun to believe that the Trojan War, and even Troy itself, might have been fiction. Heinrich Schliemann, discussed before, did not believe this, and set out to prove that Troy and the Trojan War were real. He did this by investigating and excavating at the fortress of Hisarlik. Hisar, by the way, is the Turkish word for fortress. The site technically is a tell, with multiple layers of strata. Working quickly, and rather carelessly, Schliemann used tools and dynamite to blast his way into the tell to find evidence of the city of Troy. The city of Troy was probably called Taroisa or Walusa by the Hittites, which may have inspired the Greek words for the city, Troy or Ilion. The Trojans were probably not Hittites, but they were probably not Greeks as well. They were probably called the Asua, perhaps the root word for our modern word Asia. Once again, scholars debate these names. Troy, as a settlement, was founded probably around the year 3600 BCE, and it was inhabited as late as the year 500 CE. Strata layers 6 through 7a showed evidence of warfare, fire, demolished buildings, and exposed human remains, evidence for a possible war. These layers of strata, relatively speaking, are also dated to about the same time that the historical Trojan War would have taken place, the 1260s to 1180s BCE. Here are some scenes from the Trojan War. The Trojan War, according to Homer's myth, was fought over Helen of Sparta, who was betrothed to be married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Paris, the prince of Troy, kidnaps Helen with the help of the goddess Aphrodite. There's some debate over whether Helen went with Paris willingly or not. Here's some scenes from the war itself. Homer depicts the war as being highly destructive and fratricidal, with the Greeks fighting the Trojans for over 10 years. Important Greek heroes like Achilles fight in the war and ultimately are killed. The Trojan War ends when the Greeks build a horse, which they use to get inside the city. Then they open the gates to let their comrades in, and they destroy the city, putting its residents to the sword. I mentioned the Trojan War and its causes, the kidnapping of Helen, because some historians from the period, including Herodotus, mentioned that the kidnapping of women was very common in the ancient Aegean. Here's a map of the factions that took part in the Trojan War. Once again, highlighting that the Greeks were not a unified empire or unified under one government at this time, yet they had a strong sense of identity. Even as a separate confederation of city-states and principalities. From an archaeological perspective, the Trojan War may also have taken place because Troy was in a very strategic location, close to the Dardanelles, also known as the Hellespont. This is a very strategic location nowadays, near the modern city of Istanbul, also known as Constantinople. Whoever controlled this strip of land could have controlled the Hellespont, and thus would have had very easy trade access to both Europe and Asia. As I mentioned before, this is a very strategic part of the world even today. Not so much because of trade, but because of access between the Aegean and the Black Sea. These are some illustrations of the layers of strata and human development at the Troy/Hisarlik site. Archaeologists think that the Trojan War would have taken place in layers Troy 6 and Troy 7A, shown here at the top. Here's an artist's recreation of what each of the layers would have looked like. As you can see, Troy evolves from a small settlement into a much larger city over time. The image on the left-hand side of this slide shows the various layers of strata at the Troy site. Here you can see Roman numeral 3 for Troy 3 and Roman numeral 4 for Troy 4. You can also see Troy 2 down lower because it's an older layer. Here is a map of the ruins of Troy with the various layers marked in color. As you can see, the Trojan War would have taken place somewhere towards the end of Troy 6 and during Troy 7A. This map also shows that Troy was inhabited for centuries after the destruction of Troy during the Trojan War. We can see a theater and baths from the Roman period. Here are some archaeological reconstructions of the foundations of some of the buildings at Troy. As you can see, the Trojans used a variety of stone masonry to build their buildings, similar to the Mycenaeans, suggesting a sharing of ideas as well. This marble building over here seems to have a Near Eastern or Mesopotamian influence, suggesting they were taking ideas from the East as well as the West. Here's an artist's rendering of what Troy may have looked like at about the time of the Trojan War. We can see the vivid colors of the buildings, perhaps inspired by the Minoans, but there also seems to be a Near Eastern influence in the architecture as well, as I described on a previous slide. Once again, this is an artist's rendering. It's an estimate of what the city may have looked like. Now we'll discuss a little bit of information about the excavation of Troy and why Heinrich Schliemann is a very controversial figure in archaeological history. As I mentioned before, Schliemann investigated the Troy/Hisarlik site because he wanted to prove the validity of the Homeric myths, specifically the Iliad. From 1871 to 1875 of the Common Era, Schliemann and his team worked very quickly and carelessly, even using dynamite to blast through the layers of strata to get to the level where they thought that the Troy of the Trojan War would be. Keep in mind that the field of archaeology was still professionalizing at this time, so things like this were a little bit more imaginable. Still, Schliemann's activities never escalated to the levels seen in the Indiana Jones films or similar media. Schliemann found many valuable artifacts, including gold and silver, jewelry, which he then smuggled out of Turkey and took back to Greece. Turkey at the time was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, but Greece was not. Here are some of the artifacts found by Schliemann and his team at Troy. They recovered many artifacts, simple things like pots, but they also recovered very expensive jewelry, what was labeled Priam's treasure. Priam was the king of Troy at the time of the Trojan War, according to the Homeric myths. Here you can see Schliemann's wife, Sophia, modeling some of the jewelry. By the way, Schliemann's wife was Greek. More recent archaeologists argue that Schliemann may have mixed periods of strata, probably because he used dynamite, and some of the artifacts he found may be older than Troy 6. This is, of course, why professional archaeologists don't use dynamite when they're excavating an archaeological site, why they work very carefully and painstakingly. Now that we've discussed the Trojan War, we should talk about Mycenaean burial rituals and tombs. The Mycenaean upper classes would have had their remains interred in tholos tombs. These were large monumental tombs shaped like beehives and made out of earth and masonry. While these tombs are large enough to be considered monumental, they're much smaller than the pyramids or the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. In general, the ancient Greeks did not spend as much time building large tombs for themselves as other civilizations did. But the Mycenaeans are a little bit of an exception. Their upper class build tombs that are somewhat large, but still nothing compared to what the Egyptians were doing. Here's an interior view of the Tholos tomb. As you can see from the bricks, they're parallel with the ground. This is a corbel dome. It's not a true architectural dome because these bricks are parallel with the ground. It's still very architecturally impressive, though. Some archaeologists think that the walls of these tombs may have been covered with pure gold, although we don't know that for sure. And most of the Tholos tombs were robbed not long after their construction. Here's an example of a smaller Tholos tomb. This is another image of a Tholos tomb with a human here to show the scale of these tombs. They're very large, but they're not nearly as large as the pyramids or the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. In terms of burial customs, the Mycenaeans are most known for their death masks made of gold or other metals. Perhaps the most exemplary death mask is the gold mask of Agamemnon, found by Heinrich Schliemann in 1876. This mask is actually from the 1600s BCE, about 400 years too early to be from Agamemnon. These masks could also be made with less detail, like this one in the center, or they can be made with cheaper materials, like bronze. Wealthy Mycenaeans had their bodies buried with gold and other grave goods, including weapons, highlighting the militarism of their culture. Their decision to bury their dead with goods also highlights the Mycenaeans, one, believed in an afterlife, and two, they believed that physical goods could be taken to the realm of the dead. We'll talk more about evolving Greek beliefs about death and the afterlife in future videos. Now we must talk about the end of the Mycenaean civilization. Around the year 1050 BCE, a people called the Dorians invaded/migrated to Mycenaean territory in the Peloponnesian and Attic peninsulas. Archaeologists debate the origin of the Dorians. Originally, it was thought the Dorians were from northern Europe and migrated southward, and that they were an equestrian people that rode horses and were armed with lances and iron weapons. More recent scholarship suggests the Dorians may have been an Asiatic people from Asia Minor who came to Greece via ships. Perhaps the Dorians were part of the Sea Peoples who invaded and attacked Egypt, as discussed in a previous video. The Mycenaeans may have been too weak to resist the Dorians due to previous military conflicts like the Trojan War. In addition, poor and oppressed everyday Mycenaeans might have refused to fight for their kings. They may have even regarded the Dorians as liberators. The period in Greek history from the end of Mycenaean rule to the beginning of the Archaic period has been called the Dark Age. This period lasted from about 1050 BCE to the 800s BCE. There's very little monumental archaeological evidence to be found during this period. Here are some images of what the Dorians may have looked like. The left, which is a piece of ancient Greek ceramics, suggests the Dorians may have been cavalry from northern Europe. The right shows they may have been a seafaring people, perhaps the sea peoples that we discussed in previous lectures. Either way, the Dorians helped bring an end to the Mycenaean civilization. Now we should discuss the Greek Dark Age, so-called. Was it really a Dark Age? This period, from about 1050 into the 800s BCE, was certainly chaotic. It was part of the Bronze Age collapse, experienced across the Near East, in which many civilizations struggled or collapsed. New military technology, including iron weapons and lances and mounted cavalry, may have helped the Dorians collapse the Mycenaean civilization. Previous civilizations in the ancient Near East and Greece had relied on chariots, but men mounted on larger horses would have been much more maneuverable and also much cheaper to maintain in the field than multiple horses pulling one chariot. The chaos of this period may have inspired Homer's epic poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey. Greek polytheism, as we know it, probably emerged during this so-called Dark Age as well. The instability on the Greek mainland would have inspired the creation of Greek colonies, settlements across the Mediterranean basin. This probably occurred around the 900s BCE. And the Greeks, in the setup of these settlements, would have spread their culture throughout the Mediterranean, throughout North Africa, the Black Sea, and even as far as Italy, the southern coast of what is now France and Spain as well. During this period, the Greeks moved away from the Mycenaean linear B writing system and developed the Greek alphabet, which is still in use today and has formed the basis for many other alphabets, including the Roman alphabet, which we use in English. As such, it's probably best not to call this period the Dark Ages, just because we don't know very much about it. It's not necessarily a bad time in Greek history. It's best to probably refer to this period as the Early Iron Age, or the Pre-Archaic period. Conclusion. The Bronze Age and Early Iron Age Greek civilizations shared some important similarities, but also some important differences as well. They used an Indo-European language that would evolve into Greek. They also used writing systems, linear A, linear B, and then the Greek alphabet that we know today. During this period, the Bronze Age and the Early Iron Age, there was trade of both goods and ideas. Trade by sea and travel by sea would become a defining part of Greek culture. We also saw that some of these societies, especially the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, were very stratified, with a large working and peasant class providing labor and food for a much smaller elite class. We see the Greeks' preference for stone architecture in the construction of their palaces and citadels and tombs. We also see an influence of Near Eastern artwork and North African artwork in the art of the Greek cultures during this period. The Greeks buried their bodies rather than cremating or mummifying them. They buried them in tombs that were much smaller than those used by the Egyptians, called tholos tombs. Warfare was a major part of life during the Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, as seen during the Mycenaean invasion of Crete, the Trojan War, and the Dorian invasion. The Greek alphabet, colonization, and Greek epic poetry, as seen by the work of Homer, emerged as a result of these cultural patterns. during the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. While not unified under a single government or empire, the Greeks developed a strong cultural identity as a result of their ancestors' achievements and trials during the Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. We'll talk more about how these developments influenced Greek civilization in later videos.